Hello friends, welcome to our channel Cbse English, the topper's choice. In today's video, we are going to discuss class 10th first story from the supplementary book Footprints Without Feet, A Triumph of Surgery. At the beginning, we'll talk about the author of this story. James Herriot is the author of this story. James Herriot was born on 3rd October 1916 and died on 23rd February 1995. He was a British veterinary surgeon and novelist. Born in Sunderland, James graduated from Glasgow Veterinary College in 1939, returning to England to become a veterinary surgeon in Yorkshire, where he practiced for almost 50 years. He is best known for writing a series of 8 books set in the 1930s to 1950s Yorkshire Dales about veterinary practice, animals and their owners, which began with If Only They Could Talk, first published in 1970. Now we'll talk about the theme of this story. A triumph of surgery signifies how rich parents indulge their children with expensive items, which prove harmful for their kids' health in the long run. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, is about a dog named Tricky and his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The theme of the story is about the blind love which we possess for the one whom we love the most. Mrs. Pumphrey had no idea that her blind and extreme love for her dog Tricky took him to trouble. Excessive love made Tricky sick and became a reason for his illness. It can be concluded after reading the story that excessive love can take the form of extreme consequences. Introduction to this story. The story is about Tricky, a dog, who is the pet of a rich lady named Mrs. Pumphrey. She loves her dog very much and is unable to refuse him anything he wants. Tricky is fond of eating cream cakes and chocolates. So, one day, when Mrs. Pumphrey is out with Tricky for a walk, the narrator sees them and stops to talk. While talking to Mrs. Pumphrey, he realizes that she has been overfeeding Tricky and also had been giving him things that he should not eat, due to which Tricky had started looking like a bloated sausage. Soon, Tricky got unwell, and Mrs. Pumphrey has to call Mr. Herriot, that is narrator, for help. She does not want to send him away, but the only way suggested by Mr. Herriot is to get him hospitalized for 15 days. Then the story unfolds into how he gets well. Now we'll discuss the summary of this story. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, is about a small dog, Tricky, who was always indulged by his rich mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, with tasty and unhealthy treats several times a day. Out of love, she would overfeed her pet. Gradually, Tricky gained oodles of weight and became lazy. He hardly exercised or went out for a walk due to his bloated structure. In due course of time, he became bulky and his lack of movement worried Mrs. Pumphrey. Soon, she consulted Mr. James Herriot, a veterinary surgeon, for treatment of her lethargic dog. Mr. Harriot was shocked to see Tricky's condition and took him to the hospital. He knew Mrs. Pumphrey's overindulgence would never let her pet dog lead a healthy lifestyle. He took the dog along with him and put him on a hospital bed. The dog didn't move for the first 2 days and didn't eat any food either. On the third day, Tricky went outside and played with other bigger dogs in the hospital. He ate the food that was given to him and also licked the balls of other dogs for the leftover food. Mr. Harriot gave a balanced diet to Tricky along with plenty of physical exercise. Gradually, Tricky's condition started improving and he started fighting with other dogs for the meals. His mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, would send eggs so that her pet didn't starve and get enough energy to recover from the treatment. However, James Harriot and his partners would eat the eggs daily for breakfast. Further, Mrs. Pumphrey also sent bottles of wine to improve Tricky's blood condition. But those again were consumed by Mr. Harriot and his partners. He felt sorry for eating the food that was sent by Mrs. Pumphrey for Tricky. Soon, as the little dog started showing signs of improvement, the vet decided to call the wealthy lady as she was very worried about her pet's condition. When she arrived in the hospital to fetch her pet, Tricky was very happy and jumped on her. Mrs. Pumphrey was filled with gratitude towards Mr. Harriot for curing her dog and felt she couldn't thank him enough for the wonder he had done to her pet. She felt this was indeed a triumph of surgery. Now we'll discuss the character sketch of this story. Number 1. Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey is a fabulously rich and resourceful lady with a large number of servants and maids. She is passionately attached to her little pet dog Tricky. She is much worried about Tricky's miserable condition. Tricky had become hugely fat and listless. She thinks Tricky to be suffering from malnutrition. So she starts giving Tricky malt, cod liver oil, and a ball of Horlicks every night. The doctor knew that Tricky's only fault was his greed for food. He advises Mistress Pumphrey to cut down food and sweets for Tricky. For Mrs. Pumphrey, it was very difficult because she pampers Tricky like a spoiled child. Mrs. Pumphrey is impractical but very compassionate and caring. She and her staff arrange all comforts, beds, cushions, and toys for Tricky. She constantly inquires about his health from Dr. Harriot. She gratefully thanks Dr. Harriot for saving Tricky's life and calls it a triumph of surgery. Number 2. Tricky. Tricky is a small dog. The only fault of Tricky is his greed for food. Overfeeding of sweets, cakes, and chocolates made Tricky hugely fat. He becomes roomy and listless. His tongue lolls from his jaws. The doctor advises Mrs. Pumphrey to keep Tricky on a very strict diet and give him plenty of exercises. Tricky becomes a victim of overindulgence and overfeeding. Dr. Harriot's instructions are ignored. Tricky loses appetite and starts vomiting. Dr. Heriot suggests Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky be hospitalized under his observation for a fortnight. Tricky's recovery is amazingly rapid. He is not given food but plenty of water. After a few days, Tricky starts taking an interest in his surroundings. He is transformed into a flexible and hard-muscled dog. Tricky shows his love for his mistress by jumping onto her lap when she comes to collect him. Number 3. Dr. James Heriot. Dr. James Heriot, no doubt, is a competent veterinary surgeon. He is really worried about Tricky. He understands that the real fault of the dog is his greed for food. Dr. Heriot instructs Mrs. Pumphrey to keep Tricky on a very strict diet. Dr. James Heriot is practical and pragmatic. He doesn't give any medical treatment to the dog. He feeds the dog with only water. His method works. The grateful mistress thanks Dr. Heriot and calls his feat a triumph of surgery. Dr. James is clever enough to enjoy the best of both the worlds. He is tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. It was a happy period for Dr. Heriot and his friends. He used to enjoy eggs for breakfast and wine and brandy for lunch. Now we'll discuss the main points of this story. Dr. Heriot was really worried to see the dog Tricky. He was very fat. His eyes were red and roomy. Mrs. Pumphrey, the mistress of Tricky, had been giving him malt, cod liver oil, and a ball of Horlicks every night. Dr. Heriot found that the only fault of Tricky was his greed for food. The doctor advised Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down his food rightly and give him exercise daily. Within a few days, the doctor received a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky was not eating anything and was vomiting again and again. He lay down panting and didn't go for a walk. Dr. Heriot suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky must be hospitalized for about a fortnight. The poor lady almost fainted, but at last Tricky was taken to the hospital. At the surgery, the household dogs surged around Dr. Heriot, and Tricky looked silently at them lying motionless on the carpet. For 2 days, Dr. Heriot kept an eye on Tricky and gave him no food but plenty of water. Next day, the doctor was pleased to see Tricky jostling his way to his football. No medical treatment was given to Tricky. Tricky's progress was rapid and he started running about the dogs, joining in their friendly barkings. Dr. Heriot informed Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was out of danger and was recovering rapidly. Mrs. Pumphrey was excited to hear the news and started bringing fresh eggs to build his strength. Even wine and brandy were given to improve Tricky's constitution. One day, Dr. Heriot phoned Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky had recovered and she could take him home. Within 2 weeks, Tricky had been transformed into a flexible and hard-muscled animal. When he saw his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, he leaped and reached to her lap. Mrs. Pumphrey thanked Dr. Harriot. Her eyes were wet and lips trembled. She called Tricky's recovery a triumph of surgery. So dear friends, if you have liked this video, please click on like, subscribe the channel and click on the bell icon to get more videos like this. Thank you very much for watching.